I never thought I'd be the one to cover the night shift, but I guess that's how life throws things at you sometimes. I've always been the day shift clerk at this quiet supermarket. A regular, dependable guy doing regular, dependable work. My routine was simple. Clock in at 9 a.m., deal with a steady stream of customers, and head home by 6 p.m. Easy, predictable. But last night, that all changed. It was around 8 p.m. when I got the call from my manager, Linda. Now Linda's been nothing but kind to me since I started here. She's a sweet woman, always understanding when someone needed time off or when the schedule had to shift around a bit. So, when she called and I heard the urgency in her voice, I didn't hesitate to listen. "Tom?" Her voice crackled through the phone, tense and fast. "I need you to do me a big favor tonight." I could tell something was off right away. I leaned against the kitchen counter at home, glancing at my leftover dinner. "Sure, Linda. What's going on?" It's about Jackson." Her pause felt heavy, like she was picking her words carefully. "The night shift guy. He's not answering his phone, and nobody saw him leave this morning." I frowned. Jackson? He'd been working the night shift for a few months now. Quiet guy, kept to himself, but never struck me as unreliable. Maybe he's just sleeping in, forgot to charge his phone. I wish it were that simple, Linda sighed. "I checked the cameras, Tom. He didn't leave the store." "What do you mean he didn't leave?" "I mean," she continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "he was here at 6 a.m. when the morning shift arrived, but then, nothing. He was gone. It's like he vanished." My heart skipped a beat. This was getting weird. "So, you need me to cover for him tonight?" "Just this once," she assured me. "I know it's short notice, but you're the only one who's free. Please, Tom, I'll owe you big time." Something in her voice made me uneasy, but I agreed. Linda had been good to me, and I couldn't leave her in the lurch. After all, what was the worst that could happen on a quiet night shift? "I'll do it," I said finally, "but only this once." Linda let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Tom. I owe you." By 10:30 p.m., I was on my way to the supermarket, mentally preparing myself for what I assumed would be a long, boring night. The store sat on the outskirts of town, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was one of those places that never saw much action, especially at night. I figured I'd probably be alone for most of my shift. As I approached the back entrance, I noticed something strange. The employee door, which was usually locked at this time of night, was blown open. A gust of wind pushed it back and forth on its hinges, creating an eerie creaking noise. And then I saw him, Jackson. He was standing just inside the doorway, shivering like a leaf in the wind. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Terror, maybe? He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and gaunt. "Jackson," I called out, more confused than concerned at that moment. "What the hell are you doing out here? The manager's been looking for you." Jackson didn't respond right away. He stumbled toward me, his steps unsteady. When he got close enough, I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool night air. "Tom," he rasped, barely able to form the words. Don't cover the night shift." I blinked, taken aback by the urgency in his voice. "What? What are you talking about?" "You don't understand," he muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "This place, it's not what it seems. You don't want to be here at night. Trust me." I couldn't help but feel a little irritated. Jackson had always been a bit odd, but this was too much. "Come on, man, you're freaking out. Maybe you just need a few days off." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked so weak. "No, I'm serious. Don't stay." I looked at him, puzzled. Then he continued, "But if you do stay, check the last drawer of the counter. There's something there that will help you. And for God's sake, leave at 6 a.m. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later." "Jackson, listen to me." "I'm not going back in there," he interrupted, shaking his head violently. "Not ever." Then, before I could say another word, Jackson bolted, sprinting into the darkness as if his life depended on it. I stood there for a few moments, watching Jackson disappear into the night. His behavior was bizarre, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. Working nights had probably gotten to him. People don't always think straight when they're sleep deprived. Still, something about his warning gnawed at the back of my mind. When I finally entered the store, I found the day shift clerk, Sarah, getting ready to leave. She greeted me with a tired smile, but I could see the relief on her face. She was more than ready to clock out. "Hey, Tom," she yawned. "Thanks for covering tonight." "No problem," I replied, glancing around. "By the way, did you see Jackson earlier? He was acting kind of strange." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Jackson? No, I didn't see him." I frowned. "What do you mean? He was just outside a minute ago, freaking out about something." She shook her head, clearly confused. "I didn't see anyone, and I've been here the whole time." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to shrug it off. "Weird. Maybe he was hiding out somewhere." "Maybe," Sarah said, unconvinced. "Well, good luck tonight. It's usually dead quiet, but..." She hesitated, biting her lip as if she wanted to say more. "But what?" "Nothing," she said quickly, grabbing her coat. "Just don't let it get to you. See you tomorrow." And with that, she left, leaving me alone in the quiet, fluorescent-lit store. The first few minutes were uneventful. A couple of customers wandered in, buying late-night snacks or picking up a few items they had forgotten. I scanned their goods, made small talk, and settled into what I thought would be an easy shift. Around 11:30 p.m., the store fell completely silent. There were no more customers, no more cars passing by outside, just me and the hum of the refrigerators. I began to relax, thinking maybe this night shift thing wouldn't be so bad after all. But then, as I sat behind the counter, I noticed something odd. At the far end of the store, in the dimly lit aisles, there was a figure. A customer, maybe. But they weren't moving, just standing there between two aisles, like they were waiting for something. "Hello?" I called out, peering into the darkened aisles. No response. The figure stood perfectly still at the far end of the store, where the lighting was poor, casting long, eerie shadows between the shelves. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but it was hard to tell if it was a person or just my mind playing tricks on me. The store was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerators and the low buzzing of the fluorescent lights above. "Hello," I called out again, louder this time. No response. The figure didn't move. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was probably just a customer lingering in the shadows, perhaps deciding on a late-night snack. I turned my attention to the security monitor, thinking I could get a better look at whoever it was. Oddly enough, the camera that had a direct view of that aisle showed nothing. Just empty aisles, shelves lined with products, but no person in sight. I frowned, glancing back up toward the aisle itself, and my heart skipped a beat. The figure had moved. It was closer now, just beyond the poorly lit section, but still standing unnaturally still. My eyes flicked back to the monitor. Still nothing. The figure wasn't there. It didn't make sense. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the unease settling deep in my gut. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe they were standing just in a blind spot of the camera. That had to be it. But when I looked back toward the aisle again, the figure had moved again, this time much closer. Now it stood under better lighting, but somehow the shadows still clung to them. I couldn't make out a face, just the vague silhouette of a person. They stood there, unnervingly still, as if waiting for something. My body moved before I could stop myself. I got up from behind the counter and made my way toward the aisle. As soon as I rounded the corner and entered the aisle, nothing. No one was there. I stood still for a moment, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. The store was empty. There was no one there but me. I checked every aisle, walking through each one slowly, trying to find any trace of someone having been there. But no one was inside. Eventually, I returned to the counter, telling myself that whoever it was must have left the store quietly. I checked the cameras again. All clear. No sign of any movement. And then I remembered what Jackson had told me. The drawer. I hesitated, looking at the monitor again. Midnight had just passed, and the store felt even quieter now, the silence pressing in on me. Reluctantly, I opened the last drawer behind the counter, expecting maybe some keys or supplies. Instead, my fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and read the first few lines. These are the rules that you need to follow to make it through the night shift. I found out about them the hard way, so I've noted all of them here to keep the new night shift clerks safe. If you encounter a strange event, please note it down. I rolled my eyes, thinking it was some elaborate prank by Jackson or one of my other coworkers. Still, a part of me couldn't shake off how serious Jackson had been when he warned me earlier. His voice echoed in my head, along with his exhausted, terrified expression. I continued reading the list. Rule 1. Occasionally, you'll see a shadowy figure at the far end of the store, just standing between two aisles. It will not move unless you ignore it. Always nod or wave to acknowledge its presence, and it will leave you alone. I felt a sudden rush of panic, and before I could stop myself, I shouted into the empty store. Yeah, real funny guys, really mature. My voice echoed in the aisles, but the store remained still, as if waiting. I continued reading. Rule 2. From 2 a.m. onwards, aisle 7 becomes different. Products are rearranged, the air is colder, and you will start to see strange things that aren't there. Sure, I muttered, rolling my eyes again. This had to be some weird initiation prank for covering the night shift. Still, a strange uneasiness settled into my bones as I read on. Rule 3. Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., only 5 customers can enter the store. After the 5th one, any further customers are not human, no matter how they appear. Count them carefully, and if a 6th enters, lock yourself in the back office and do not leave until you're sure they've gone. My eyes widened as I read that one. I forced myself to keep reading. Rule 4. No matter what happens, aisle 3 must be cleaned at exactly 2:45 a.m. every night. A spill will appear on the floor out of nowhere, and you must clean it up as soon as you see it. Ignoring it will cause the spill to spread, and soon you'll notice wet footprints appearing around the store. I chuckled nervously. This was getting ridiculous. Rule 5. If the back door is left unlocked, someone or something will enter after midnight. You won't notice them, but you will feel an unsettling chill, as if someone is standing behind you. A chill ran down my spine just as I read that line. I instinctively glanced behind me at the back door, which I'd left unlocked, thinking no one would bother coming through there. We never locked it during the day, so why bother at night? The next rule sent another wave of dread through me. Rule 6. Occasionally, you might catch a glimpse of yourself walking the aisles, stocking shelves, or mopping the floors. Whatever you do not approach them and do not let them see you. A sense of unease started growing in the pit of my stomach. I tried laughing it off, but the truth was, this list was starting to get to me. I continued reading, my fingers trembling. Rule 7. If you hear sobbing or cries for help from the manager's office, do not go inside. The door may be ajar. The crying will get louder the closer you get. And if you open the door, it will stop. Something else will be waiting in the silence. I threw the list back in the drawer to forget all about it, when something in the corner of my eye made me freeze. A shadow flickered across the security monitor near the back door. I had to make sure no one had come in. I hurried toward the back door, expecting to find one of my coworkers sneaking around, trying to scare me. But when I reached the door, no one was there. The air felt unnaturally cold, and a draft blew in through the still open back door. I slammed it shut, feeling a shiver crawl up my neck. I locked it. Just as I turned around, there was a faint knock on the door. A cold sweat broke out on my skin, and I slowly turned back toward the door. I opened it, expecting a colleague of mine to jump out and scare me. But there was no one there. The back alley was empty. I stepped outside, glancing around. Nothing. Not a soul. I shut the door and locked it. As I got back to the counter, my heart skipped a beat. I felt a cold, icy presence behind me. So real, I could almost feel the breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, nothing but the wall. The chill lingered, creeping up my spine as I stood there, breathing heavily. Rule 5 echoed in my mind. I could feel something watching me. I had to get a grip on myself, shake off the lingering dread that clung to my skin. Standing still behind the counter wasn't helping. The rules were unsettling, sure, but that's all they were, words on paper. I needed to move around, clear my head, and remind myself that this was just a quiet, empty store. I decided to do a quick walk through the aisles, maybe even restock a few items to keep myself busy. The familiar routine would ground me, keep me from spiraling further into paranoia. As I walked along the aisles, everything seemed normal at first. The familiar rows of snacks, canned goods, and drinks stacked neatly in their places. But as I made my way toward the freezers at the back of the store, something caught my eye. There was an ice cream carton lying on the floor, right in front of the freezer doors. It was still sealed, perfectly intact, but just sitting there like someone had dropped it. I frowned. No one had been in this section recently. The few customers I'd had earlier didn't even go near the freezers. I bent down to pick it up, telling myself it was nothing. I stood up with the carton in hand, and as I reached out to open the freezer door, something cold and solid wrapped around my wrist. The sensation was all too real, yet there was nothing visible holding me. I yanked my hand back, pulling it toward my chest as I stumbled backward. My eyes darted around the freezer aisle. There was no one here. But I had felt it. Something had grabbed me. Panic surged through me, cold and sharp. I stared at my hand, my skin tingling where the grip had been. Thin red marks, tracing the outline of where those fingers had been. They were narrow, and there were only 3 distinct markings, like the hand that had grabbed me had only 3 fingers. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself, but my voice sounded small, almost drowned out by the eerie situation. I rushed back, my hand still tingling from the icy touch. The thin red lines on my wrist were still there, burning slightly, as if whatever had touched me had left a mark deeper than just on the surface. When I reached the counter, I leaned against it, breathing heavily, my heart still racing in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling of the cold, thin fingers gripping my wrist. I was still staring at my hand when something shifted in the corner of my vision. My head snapped up, eyes darting toward the back of the store, and that's when I saw it again. The figure, just like before, standing between the aisles in the poorly lit section. Its form was obscured by shadows, but I knew it was the same figure from earlier. That unsettling presence I had seen but convinced myself wasn't real. It was standing there, staring at me, unmoving. This time, I felt the panic creeping up faster. Rule number 1. Always nod or wave to acknowledge its presence, and it will leave you alone. Was this really happening? I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat making it difficult to breathe. I lifted my arm slowly and gave a small, hesitant wave toward the shadowy figure at the end of the aisle. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward or shift in any way. But then, its face, or what passed for a face, lit up with an unnerving, wide grin. The smile was impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear, teeth gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. It wasn't a smile of joy or warmth. It was too sharp, too predatory. It radiated a faint, unnatural glow, like the smile itself was made of something otherworldly. And then, the figure vanished. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. This wasn't my imagination. Something was happening, something far worse than I had been prepared for. "Oh my God," I whispered, my heart pounding harder than ever. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt weak, my mind racing. With trembling hands, I opened the drawer again, the faint creak of the wood making my heart jump. I fumbled inside, feeling the familiar rough texture of the folded paper. The list of rules. I had to double-check it, make sure I hadn't missed anything crucial. My mind was spinning after what had just happened, but I needed something concrete to hold on to, even if it was just a set of bizarre, unsettling rules. As I unfolded the paper, the front door chimed. I flinched, my nerves still on edge, but it was only a customer, a middle-aged man. He looked normal enough. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. It's fine, just another customer, I thought, trying to force my heart rate back to normal. He nodded to me briefly and walked further into the store. I watched him for a second, then turned my attention back to the list, clinging to it like a lifeline. "Okay," I muttered under my breath, scanning the rules. Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., count the customers, no more than 5. I glanced at the clock on the wall, just past 1 a.m. So far, only this middle-aged guy had come in. Customer number 1, I had to keep track. No room for mistakes. At 2:45 a.m., clean aisle 3. I sighed. It seemed simple enough, in theory. But after what had already happened tonight, nothing felt simple anymore. Still, the market wasn't large. I could handle counting a few customers and cleaning one aisle. I repeated the steps to myself, like a mantra, trying to find comfort in the routine. Another customer walked in as the middle-aged man finished checking out, wishing me a good night as he took his bag and left. I watched him walk through the automatic doors and disappear into the night. That's 2, I thought. I mentally added the new arrival to the count. Then, the woman who entered next didn't glance at me. She didn't say a word. She walked straight ahead, her eyes locked in a distant, unblinking stare. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, like she was being controlled. Her skin, pale and almost unnaturally smooth, shimmered under the store's fluorescent lights, as if it wasn't skin at all but something else, something artificial. I watched her as she disappeared into one of the aisles, breaking the line of sight. My breath caught in my throat. It took everything in me not to follow her, to see if she was real or something else entirely. But I shook my head, forcing myself to stay behind the counter. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, trying to sound convincing. "Just a weird customer." I glanced at the clock again. It was just past 2 a.m. Aisle 7 was the next danger zone, according to the rules. I'd have to avoid it for the rest of the night, and that felt like the simplest thing in the world compared to what I'd already encountered. I checked the security monitor, peeking at the dim view of Aisle 7. Everything seemed normal. At around 2:30 a.m., the door chimed again. I turned to see another customer enter. A man, this one seemingly normal. He wandered through the aisles, picking up a few items. I breathed a small sigh of relief, grateful that he seemed ordinary. But something nagged at me. The third customer, the woman with the robotic movements, I hadn't seen her leave. My eyes flicked back to the monitor, and I switched through the different camera angles. Nothing. No sign of her anywhere in the store. Maybe she left and I didn't notice, I thought, trying to convince myself. But the pit of unease in my stomach only grew deeper. 4 customers now. I mentally ticked them off, hoping and praying that no more would come before 4 a.m. The idea of encountering a 6th customer was something I couldn't even bear to think about. I watched the newest customer as he checked out with his goods, offering a polite good night as he walked out. 4, I reminded myself. The minutes ticked by slowly, dragging like hours. And then my attention snapped to the clock. It was almost 2:45 a.m. Time to clean aisle 3, I thought, dread settling in my gut like a stone. I grabbed the mop and bucket from the back room and slowly made my way to the aisle. My footsteps echoed in the quiet store, the squeak of the wheels on the mop bucket sounding unnervingly loud. But just as I reached the aisle, I heard something. A whisper, faint and distant. I froze, gripping the handle of the mop. The sound seemed to drift through the air, faint but unmistakable. It was calling my name. I turned slowly, the whisper growing clearer, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat hammering in my ears. The sound was coming from the other side of the store, near aisle 7. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward the sound, each step reluctant, but something compelled me forward. The whisper grew louder the closer I got. My name, over and over again, like a distant plea. I reached the edge of aisle 7, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew. But something took over, some dark curiosity that made me peek around the corner. And what I saw made my blood turn to ice. The aisle wasn't normal anymore. Mannequins stood scattered throughout, posed as if shopping, their stiff limbs dressed in tattered clothing. Their plastic faces were blank, yet they radiated a silent menace that I couldn't explain. It was as if they'd been caught mid-action, and the second I looked, they froze in place. I pulled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I took a breath and peeked again, against every instinct telling me not to. This time, all the mannequins were looking directly at me. I staggered back, my hands shaking, my pulse roaring in my ears. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet stayed planted to the spot, frozen in terror. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. And then, at the far end of the aisle, I spotted her. Customer number 3. The woman with the robotic movements. She stood at the end of the aisle, staring directly at me, her face blank. My heart dropped into my stomach. She was there. Suddenly, she moved. No, she burst toward me, her body jerking unnaturally, her limbs flailing in that same mechanical rhythm. I let out a strangled cry and bolted, sprinting as fast as I could away from aisle 7. I could hear the heavy thud of her footsteps growing louder, faster. As the sound of footsteps reached the edge of the aisle, they stopped. I whipped around and there was nothing. No sign of her, no sound. I ran back to the counter, gasping for air. My hands flew to the security monitor, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the cameras. Aisle 7 appeared normal on the feed. No mannequins, no woman. Just an empty, quiet aisle. And then, from somewhere deep in the store, I heard my name again. This time, I wasn't playing this game anymore. I glanced at the clock. It was past 2:45 a.m. Aisle 3. I need to clean aisle 3. I grabbed the mop and bucket, my legs feeling weak beneath me. I bolted toward aisle 3, dread pooling in my stomach. As I approached, my heart sank further. There was a pool of something on the floor. A thick, dark liquid spread across the tiles, glistening under the store's fluorescent lights. Worse, I could see wet footprints leading away from the puddle, small and childlike, heading toward the far end of the aisle. I didn't have time to think. I just moved. I rushed toward the spill, plunging the mop into the murky liquid and furiously scrubbing the floor. My hands shook as I worked, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What is this, I thought, panic clawing at my mind. What is leaving these footprints? I mopped and scrubbed, my heart pounding in my ears. The footprints led toward the end of the aisle, but as I got closer, they stopped just around the corner, vanished, as if whatever had left them had simply disappeared. I stared down at the now clean floor, my hands trembling around the handle of the mop. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I didn't know what was real. I left the mop and bucket behind and stumbled back to the counter, feeling completely drained, physically and mentally. Exhausted, terrified. My chest heaved as I leaned against the counter, gasping for breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the darkness. I thought about Jackson again, how exhausted and terrified he had been when he warned me. He must have gone through all of this, experienced every one of these horrifying things to make that list of rules. A part of me wondered how he had survived it. Another part of me wasn't sure he had. It was nearing 4 a.m., and I was almost done with Rule 3, counting customers. Or at least, I thought I was. Somewhere along the way, amidst the strange events, I had lost track. My mind had been all over the place, jumping from one unsettling moment to another. The panic of the night had scrambled my focus. I tried to piece it back together, but the harder I thought, the more I realized I wasn't sure how many customers had actually come in. Then the entrance door chimed, its sharp sound jolting me out of my thoughts. My head snapped toward the door, and in walked a lone customer. He were bundled up in a thick winter coat, the hood pulled low over their face, which was strange. Something about him immediately set me on edge. The way he moved, slow, aimless, like he had no real purpose in the store. He didn't look around, didn't acknowledge me. He just wandered, drifting between the aisles, never picking anything up. I watched him carefully, my nerves taut, trying to figure out if this was the 5th customer or something else. The rule replayed in my mind. After the 5th customer, any others are not human. If a 6th enters, lock yourself in the back office. My heart pounded in my chest. Was this the 5th customer? The night had become a blur of fear and confusion, and now I couldn't remember what was real anymore. As I stared at the man, something odd caught my eye. His reflection in the store's large front windows. It wasn't right. The image flickered, glitching in and out like a broken video feed. The movements looked distorted, out of sync with their actual body. My stomach twisted with dread. Suddenly, the man stopped dead in their tracks, standing perfectly still. Slowly, he turned to face me, and I could feel the weight of their gaze through the shadows of the hood. Two pale, ghostly eyes stared out from the darkness, locking onto me. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. And it felt like they were looking straight into my soul, seeing something in me that no one should ever see. Panic hit me like a freight train. I bolted from the counter, my legs moving on pure instinct. I didn't care what he was. I just knew I needed to get away. My heart thundered in my chest as I ran toward the back office, my footsteps echoing through the empty store. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the customer far behind me. But he was much closer than he should have been, gliding across the floor without moving his legs, almost like a statue being dragged, his eyes still fixed on me, unblinking. I pushed myself harder, sprinting through the aisles until I reached the back office. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Silence enveloped me like a suffocating blanket, just the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, a low-pitched hum began to vibrate through the walls. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, resonating from behind the door like some kind of electrical charge building in the air. I gulped, pressing my ear to the door, trying to make sense of it. My body was frozen with fear, my breath shallow and quiet, not daring to make a sound. The hum persisted for what felt like an eternity, filling the air with an ominous tension. And then, it faded away. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, like the store itself was holding its breath. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, my back pressed against the door, waiting for something to happen. But the only thing that greeted me was the eerie, suffocating stillness of the night. Eventually, the fear began to dull and curiosity took over. I hadn't heard anything for a while. Slowly, cautiously, I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling as I turned it. I cracked the door open, peeking out into the store. Everything seemed normal. The aisles were empty, the lights buzzing faintly overhead. There was no sign of the customer, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But I knew better than to trust appearances now. Nothing felt right. I made my way back to the counter, the tension of the night still buzzing beneath my skin. But there was a slight sense of relief beginning to creep in. I glanced at the monitor once more, scanning the empty aisles. The store was deserted, just as it should be. One more hour, one last stretch, and I'd be free of this nightmare for good. I kept watching the clock, the minutes ticking away slowly. It was almost over, just a little longer, and I'd be walking out of here, never to return to the night shift again. With each passing second, the weight on my shoulders lifted slightly. It was almost 6 a.m. No customers had come in during the last few hours, or so I thought. The store had been quiet, unnaturally so, but I was grateful for it. The fewer customers, the fewer things that could go wrong. Then, just as I was beginning to feel a flicker of hope, a soft knock echoed from the back door. I froze, my mind racing. I glanced at the clock. It was 5:50 a.m., 10 minutes until I could leave. I hesitated. The knock came again, firmer this time. Reluctantly, I walked toward the back door, each step slow and cautious. I unlocked it and opened it carefully. Standing there, smiling, was one of my colleagues from the day shift. "Hey," he said casually. "How was the night?" You look like you've seen something. I stared at him, feeling a pit of dread growing in my stomach. Yeah, I muttered, my voice hollow. You could say that. He proceeded towards the counter. As he stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sense of impending doom weighed on me, and my heart began to race again. I glanced around the dimly lit store, my nerves on edge. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and then, without warning, everything went dark. The store was plunged into pitch blackness, and my breath caught in my throat. It was still dark outside, far too early for daylight, and now the store felt completely cut off from the world. My pulse quickened as I realized the power had gone out. I grabbed a flashlight from the back office, flicking it on in the suffocating darkness. I bolted toward the counter to check on my colleague, but when I got there, he was gone. I scanned the aisles with the flashlight, but there was no sign of him. I ran to the door, my flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. But when I reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. I turned, shining the flashlight through the glass. What I saw made my blood run cold. The world outside wasn't just dark. It was void, an abyss. The light from my flashlight didn't penetrate it at all. It was as if the darkness was swallowing the light whole, consuming everything beyond the threshold of the store. I couldn't see anything. No buildings, no streetlights, nothing. The clock on the wall caught my eye, and my stomach dropped. It was 6:02 a.m. Jackson told me to leave at 6 a.m. sharp. Not earlier, not later. I felt panic rising in my throat as the realization hit me. I had made a terrible mistake. I began running around the store, desperate, trying to figure out what to do. I had no plan, no idea what was happening, but I needed to escape. The store felt different now, like the walls were closing in. The aisles seemed to stretch and warp, twisting in ways that defied logic. Voices echoed through the space, whispers, groans, distant sobs. I could hear the mannequin woman from earlier, her stiff, robotic movements shuffling through the aisles. Somewhere behind me, the man in the winter coat moved soundlessly, his hollow eyes still searching. I didn't know what was real anymore, or how long I'd been running. The store was changing, shifting, the aisles no longer obeying the rules of space and time. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as the voices grew louder, the walls seeming to pulse around me. I turned a corner, only to find myself back where I started. No matter which direction I ran, it all looped endlessly. Time was slipping away too. My mind struggled to hold on to moments, to figure out if seconds or hours were passing. I screamed, though I didn't know if any sound came out. Everything blurred together as my movements became frantic. My body felt weightless, as if I was floating through the chaos, trapped in an endless loop of repeating aisles and shifting shadows. Suddenly, I found myself back at the rear of the store, standing just by the back door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. I shoved it open, bursting out into the cool night air. The world outside was still dark, but now it was the familiar darkness of early night, not the void I had seen earlier. I glanced at my watch, my heart pounding in my ears. It was 11 p.m. With shaking hands, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pen and the list of rules. My hand trembled as I scribbled down the last entry. Rule 8. Whatever you do, leave the supermarket at 6 a.m. sharp. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. If you don't, the store will feel different, like it's been sealed away from the world. The aisles will shift and stretch, and strange entities will roam through the store. You'll be trapped with them until night falls again. I stared at the note, my heart sinking as I realized just how real these rules were. I glanced down at my hand, the same hand that had felt the icy grip earlier, and the 3-fingered markings were still faintly visible on my skin. This was real, every part of it. As I stood there, one of my colleagues approached the back of the store, waving at me casually. "Hey, everyone's been looking for you," he said, as if nothing was wrong. "You all right?" I didn't respond. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. "I'm taking the night shift tonight," he added. "Is there anything I should know?" I swallowed hard, pulling out the list of rules and handed it to him. "This is not a joke," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Read them, follow them, exactly." He looked at me, confused, but I didn't wait for a response. I just turned and walked away, my footsteps heavy with the weight of what I had experienced. I knew I couldn't explain it to him, couldn't convince him of what was coming. I left the supermarket behind, knowing I would never return, not during the day, and certainly not during the night.